Alright, welcome back to EconTruth.com. We're going to jump right into it with this post. This is the first real economics lesson, and it's going to come in the form of a story. And the story is entitled The Broken Window. Now, this is a story that was written many years ago by Bastiat, who was a French writer during the Enlightenment period. And the story, I think, is just a marvelous story that really gets to the heart of one of the most common fallacies and misunderstandings about economics, and it has many lessons you can take away from this story. And in the follow postings, I'm going to address some of the specific lessons that we can learn from this story, but this posting is going to be focused just on the story itself. And so I'm going to try to do my best to tell the story in the spirit of Bastiat's original story. I'm going to add a little bit of characterization and maybe jazzed up, make it a little bit more interesting. But for the most part, the story is, I think, does justice to his story. So I want you to imagine that this story takes place in the time and the place in which you were a child. So wherever you grew up, your hometown, that's where this story takes place. And so it's on Main Street of this hometown, and it's late at night, and there's some kids who are out causing trouble. And one of them picks up a brick, and he throws it through a window. Now, the kid doesn't know it, but it turns out this window is the storefront window of the town bakery. And the bakery is owned and managed by Mr. Baker, nonetheless. And so the next morning, there's a crowd of people who's gathered in front of this bakery, and they're talking, very negative about this. And they say things like, oh, this is just such a shame, and this couldn't happen to a nicer guy. And they say things like, oh, when we were kids, we had respect for property and a respect for authority. We would never do this, and this just shows how our town is falling apart, and obviously very negative about this broken window. And there's a man in the crowd whose name is, I don't think Bastiat actually had characters and didn't have names, but my story has characters and it's got names, and so this guy's name is Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith is, most people consider him to be the smartest man in the town. He's definitely the most educated, and he's kind of just considered the town intellectual. He is one of the few members to have gone to a university, and he has several degrees from prestigious universities. And so someone in the crowd yells out to Mr. Smith, and he says, hey, Mr. Smith, don't you think that this is a real shame? Like, isn't this just a really bad deal, this broken window? And Mr. Smith steps forward and he says, well, I'm reminded of my first lecture in the field of economics when the professor told us that if we really wanted to understand economics, we had to train ourselves to look at the net effect of a policy or the net effect of an action on all people. That you can't just cherry pick and look at the effect on one person or one group. You have to look at the effect on the whole. And so the townsperson yells back and says, well, how does that apply here? I mean, obviously it's bad for Mr. Baker. He has to replace his window, but who else is affected by this? And so Mr. Smith continues, says, yeah, exactly. So it's obviously bad for Mr. Baker, but there's more to it than that. So now Mr. Baker, he has to buy a new window. He has to replace his window. And let's just say that that's going to cost him maybe $100. And so I guess my question for you is, where does the $100 go? Does Mr. Baker, does he burn it, or does he flush it down the toilet in exchange for this window? It's like, no, obviously not. He transfers the $100 to the guy who manages the window repair store, the window repair guy. And so it's obviously bad for Mr. Baker, but it's good for the window repair guy. And furthermore, the $100 itself is not lost. It's just transferred. And so right away the crowd is kind of interested. They say, boy, yeah, we didn't even think of that. We didn't even consider that this is going to be good for somebody. We just thought this was only negative. And a lot of the negative to Mr. Baker is actually offset by the fact that it's positive for the window repair guy. And Mr. Smith continues, says, but that's not the end of the story. It doesn't end there. Because now that the window repair guy, since he has an additional order of one more window he has to repair, he now needs to place an order with the window factory. And likewise, the window factory, when they get an additional order for one more window, they have to increase their orders for their raw materials. Say they get some kind of refined sand maybe to make the glass, and they get wood for the frames from some lumber mill. And so they have to increase their orders to those, producers. And then now those producers, when they have increased orders, they have to increase their means of production, either by hiring more people, or they have to maybe buy more equipment. And that means increased orders to the factory that makes that equipment, the sand refining equipment, say. And so it just keeps going, because every time a new order is placed, that means new business and new jobs for somebody who's like further upstream in the chain of supply. And this is all growth. This is all economic growth that is created by this broken window. If the broken window hadn't happened, then none of this growth, none of these transactions would have happened at all. And he goes on and he says that the total growth, the total positive from all of these transactions and all of the subsequent transactions down the line, the total positive is actually far greater than the original cost of $100 to Mr. Baker. And he explains that that's called the multiplier effect, which is the economic term for this concept of kind of rebuying and replacing orders once you place an order and it creates growth. And now the crowd is just amazed. They're just stunned. They can't believe that they missed this. First of all, they were so focused on how it's bad for the baker, they didn't even consider all of the gains and all of these new jobs and all of this new productivity and this new production that's going to happen in order to buy this new window, because this new demand for a new window because the window is broken, and they totally missed it. And one guy in the crowd, he even goes so far as to say, well, how about this, Mr. Smith, since we're all going to be more prosperous because all of this growth is now going to happen from this new window, isn't it also true that maybe we're going to be able to afford more baked goods from Mr. Baker? Because we're going to be more prosperous, we can now buy more products from him. And so, originally we thought he was going to be out $100. He might recover some of those losses because of all of this growth. And Mr. Smith, now he's really happy. He says, exactly, now you're starting to get it, because you're starting to realize how interconnected we are and how, when the economy grows, that helps everybody, and everybody's going to be connected in that. Now, while he's telling this story, there's another man in the crowd, and we'll give him a name. Again, I don't think Bastiat had names, but we'll give him the name of Roger. And Roger is kind of the opposite of Mr. Smith, say. Roger did not go to college. Roger's not very well educated. He barely graduated high school. He's not an academic in any way, but he's not dumb. In fact, he's very smart. He's just a different kind of smart. He's more like a street smart, say. Now, Roger also has a reputation for being a real straight shooter and being very honest and very direct. And so someone looks over and notices Roger's just not really contributing. He's just kind of listening to the story, and they say, Roger, what do you think about this explanation, about Mr. Smith's explanation of this broken window? And Roger steps forward, and the crowd gets real quiet, because when Roger talks, people listen. And Roger steps forward and he says, bullshit. And, he's a man of few words, but people are kind of surprised. What did Roger just say? And Roger said, I said that's a bullshit story. Only a fool would think that we are going to be more prosperous as a result of the destruction of our property. That any child could tell you that if you destroy your property, you're going to be poorer, not richer. And Mr. Smith jumps in, and he's kind of defensive, and he says, no, Roger, you weren't listening. You didn't understand, there's more to it than that. You're only focused on this one person, on Mr. Baker. You have to consider the effect on everybody. And he goes on to kind of continue his story, or his explanation, and Roger stops him and says, no, bullshit. You are the one, Mr. Smith, who is not considering everybody. You are the one who's cherry-picking your results, and you're only looking at one specific group, this group of the window industry, and you're ignoring everybody else that are people who are involved in this story that you're not considering. And so Mr. Smith says, well, okay, so obviously you're paying attention, so who am I missing? Who am I not considering in my analysis of this? And Roger goes on, he says, well, I'll tell you, it might help if you actually knew Mr. Baker. He says, I know Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker is one of my best friends. We grew up together. Our families are really close. And just the other night, we went out and we had a few beers, and Mr. Baker was telling me how he was really excited to buy a new suit. And he had told me he'd finally saved up enough money to buy this suit. And it meant a lot to him because his father never owned a suit, his grandfather never owned a suit. He was going to be the first man in his family to buy this suit. And so he viewed this as prosperity, not only that he had achieved prosperity, but he had hoped that this suit was going to lead to more prosperity in the future because he could wear it and he could be well presented when he went out to public functions, and this was going to be the beginning of a much better life for him and his family. And he told me that he had been to the tailor several times and already picked out the design, but his plan was today, this afternoon, to go down to the tailor and place the order for this new suit. And you know how much that suit was going to cost? It was going to cost $100. But now he's not going to buy that suit, because instead he's going to buy this window that he didn't need. Now, Mr. Smith, you tell us about this growth of all these new jobs that are created in the windowing industry, and that's all created by the broken window. And I guess I want to ask you this. Wouldn't that same growth have happened anyway? It just would have happened through the tailor instead of the windowing industry, because he was going to buy the suit. And just like the window repair guy, the tailor also has suppliers. He buys his fabric from a fabric factory, and he buys his sewing machines presumably from some appliance factory, and those factories have suppliers, just like the exact same supply chain multiplier that's now going to happen in the windowing industry, it was going to happen in the tailoring industry. And so the broken window didn't create that, it just transferred where that growth was going to happen. And the crowd, after he says this, the crowd is kind of realizing, yeah, Roger has a pretty good point here. Mr. Baker was going to buy something else. He was going to buy a suit. And that same growth that we're now giving credit to the broken window, it was going to happen anyway. And so Mr. Smith steps forward, and he's kind of sheepish, and he says, yeah, Roger, I think you're right. I think I did exactly what I said in the beginning you can't do. I was so focused on one individual group that I didn't consider the effect on other people, and those people would have been the people that would have received the growth had Mr. Baker been allowed to, buy whatever it was he was going to buy. In this case, it's a suit. And he goes on, he says, when you consider that, I think I'm going to correct myself. This is not a net positive. What it is it's a zero. It's a net balance, because the growth that's now going to happen in the windowing industry is simply the growth that would have happened in the tailoring industry, so that kind of cancels out, and the net effect is zero. It's like this broken window didn't really change anything in terms of the prosperity or the economic growth of our community. And the crowd seems to accept that. They say, okay, so it turns out this broken window is not so great, which, they kind of knew that in the back of their mind to begin with, that it doesn't make sense that we'd be so much better off by breaking windows, but it makes sense that maybe it just doesn't really change anything. Until Roger steps forward again, and he says, no, bullshit, because now you're not considering the effect on the baker himself. We already know that it's negative for him. Look at it from his perspective. If the window had not been broken, he'd have his original unbroken window, and he'd have himself this new suit. But because his window was broken, now he's going to have this new replacement window that he didn't need, and he's not going to have that suit. And that is the real cost. That's the real net effect of this act of vandalism, is that our society is now poorer by exactly one suit. There's one suit that was going to exist, and now it's not, which of course is the value of one window, which gets me to my point originally that any child could tell you that when you destroy your property, you're now poorer by the value of the property that you destroyed. And so that is the broken window story. Like I said, the next few posts are going to really dive into this story and kind of uncover some of the lessons to be learned from this broken window story. Some of them are obvious. I think some of them are a little more subtle, but we'll deal with them for the next 3 blogs. So, enjoy!